The events of Star Trek The Next Generation, Deep Space Nine, and Voyager all take place around the same point in the Star Trek timeline, and they all have lasting consequences. Decades after all those series aired, a new Star Trek series was created to examine the legacy of those events through the eyes of its eponymous character, Admiral Jean-Luc Picard. However, Star Trek Picard has been the subject of much criticism from longtime Star Trek fans. So, which aspects of Picard make it so controversial? From first glance, it largely seems like Star Trek didn't need a new series focusing on the character of Jean-Luc Picard because he was already the main character of the series with the most runtime of any Star Trek to date, The Next Generation. Star Trek Picard is also made to be a sequel to The Next Generation, but TNG already had that. It's 4 movies. Star Trek Picard is speculated to be a product of 80s and 90s nostalgia, and that theory may or may not have some merit to it, especially with the focus of the 3rd season seemingly being the reunion of the TNG cast. As I said, a series taking place at this point in the timeline, the turn of the 24th into the 25th century, was warranted, but this one was not handled nearly as well as it could have been. It could have taken place when it did, but had more of a focus on the new characters introduced in the series rather than the returning ones, instead giving them a more supportive role like Riker in Lower Decks or Janeway in Prodigy. If they really wanted a series centered around the character of Jean-Luc Picard, they could have made it a prequel about his time commanding the Stargazer, in a similar way that Star Trek Strange New Worlds is about Captain Pike's command of the Enterprise. After Picard got so much screen time between The Next Generation and its 4 movies, it felt like his arc was complete. Anyway, let's break down the series from beginning to end, season by season, and see which elements are the most negatively perceived. The series opens with the story of how in 2385, all synthetic intelligence operating within Mars's Utopia Planitia shipyard suddenly goes rogue and attacks the facility, resulting in a ban on all synthetic life within the Federation. It strikes me as odd that Starfleet would use seemingly sentient synthetic life forms as laborers. Since people no longer need to work for money in order to survive, all the shipyards would need to do is offer good enough benefits to entice enough people to work there that it would be fully staffed without the synthetics. Admiral Picard goes in for a live interview where he's asked about this event and the 2387 Romulan supernova, which really unfairly puts him on the spot. He's pressed to the point where he expresses that Starfleet's inappropriate responses to both of these events made it so that it wasn't Starfleet anymore. Picard goes to live at Chateau Picard and oversee its vineyards. He is shown to be doing this in his visions of the future from the TNG series finale All Good Things, but Star Trek Generations establishes that Picard's brother, sister-in-law, and nephew were all killed in a fire. Whether or not the fire occurred at Chateau Picard, the place would probably hold painful memories for Jean-Luc as the place where the 3 once lived. TNG made it clear that Picard's passion, apart from serving in Starfleet, is archaeology, so he likely only went back to the vineyard since he was the last surviving Picard, and he just didn't really know where else to go. At least Lower Decks acknowledges his passion for archaeology by having a small plot point about him sponsoring research into it. Episode 1 is a bit reminiscent of the Deep Space Nine episode The Visitor, with Dodge coming to Picard for help and him being friendly and hospitable towards her. However, Episode 1 also sets the stage for what the entire series is going to be like, since it features the violent murder of Dodge's boyfriend and later Dodge herself. We spend the entire episode becoming sympathetic for Dodge only to see her killed at the end, which just made me think, what was was the point? In the following episodes, we learn about Dodge's twin sister Soji, whom Picard now wants to help since she is likely also in danger. Picard is also personally motivated because he learns that Dodge and Soji are synthetic life forms created from the backup of Data's positronic brain. Picard first goes to Starfleet asking for help, but they deny it. The manner in which Admiral Clancy speaks to Picard is so ridiculously unprofessional that it seems unrealistic, even for a conversation taking place behind closed doors. It's like the series trying way too hard to be edgy and loudly proclaiming, "Hey, look, we can have characters say the F word now." Anyway, this prompts Picard to gather some old friends he knows he can trust to go on the mission with him. These are all characters who are new to the series, which I liked seeing. I always enjoy a story about a ragtag group coming together like this, although with Star Trek in particular, I think Prodigy did it better. We also see the team joined by Seven of Nine, a nice little nod to Voyager that I didn't mind. We also learn that Seven of Nine was forbidden from joining Starfleet just because she's ex-Borg, even though the entire crew of Voyager were lauded as heroes when they returned to Federation space. If Picard could go back to Starfleet after he had been Locutus of Borg, there's no reason why Seven couldn't go into Starfleet as well. Seven of Nine's reappearance also brings with it more graphic violence, first with the flashback scene of Icheb's torture, and then with Seven murdering everyone she deems responsible. We get to see a collaborative project for rehabilitating ex-Borgs run by none other than Hugh, but of course he and several of the other ex-Borgs are killed off just a few episodes later. Star Trek bringing back fan-favorite characters just to kill them off is nothing new. They did it with Kalar in TNG, and even Captain Kirk of all people in Generations, but this series seems to be a little too liberal with it all. So, was there anything actually positive about Picard Season 1? Believe it or not, yes. The long-term ramifications of both the Romulan supernova and Picard's loss of his family warranted further exploration, which the series does get into, starting with this season. I liked how Riker and Troy named their daughter Kestra after Deanna's older sister who tragically died as a child, and how they settled on a nice peaceful planet together, staying even after the tragic death of their son Thaddeus. Thad's death is a good allegory for vital healthcare being inaccessible for arbitrary reasons, but the series doesn't go as far with it as it could have. I liked the season's conclusion having the theme of peace over violence. The element of Picard feeling like he needs to know if part of his deceased friend survived actually reminded me a lot of The Search for Spock. In a good way. Unfortunately, there's still plenty to criticize. All those holo displays look way too high-tech for this point in the timeline. Sure, holodecks exist, but they're an entire room of holo emitters, and even the Doctor's mobile emitter was only made possible using 29th century technology. The Zhat Vash trying to sabotage Utopia Planitia in particular doesn't make a lot of sense, considering the ships being used to evacuate their home world were being built there. I've also seen people pointing out that Rafi is portrayed as a stereotypical drug-using black mother. They never even really explain why exactly she's estranged from her son, just one example of potential development for the newly introduced characters being overlooked in favor of the pre-existing ones. Moving on to Season 2, it turns out that the whole season is a time travel story about going back to the past to fix an event that will ensure the utopian future of the Federation. Considering how many times Star Trek had done this before, we definitely didn't need a 10-episode, season-long arc about it. I noticed immediately that the dystopian alternate reality Picard and the others all find themselves in is very reminiscent of the Mirror Universe to the point of coming across as derivative. The Mirror Universe had already been used in Season 1 of Star Trek Discovery, so this time, it had to be something different. Then there's Season 2's depiction of Earth in 2024. It's mostly pretty accurate except for one thing, the Europa mission. Of course, this is contrary to real life when we just sent a probe to Europa and haven't made it out to Mars yet, but to me, it also seemed a bit hard to believe that such a significant space mission would happen the same year as the Bell riots and before the riots themselves. In real life, there have been historic events during times of social turmoil, such as the moon landing happening during the civil rights movement, but Star Trek thus far has largely been about how Earth's society has to improve itself to become more equitable before space travel can really become a focus. We'd also seen before that early missions to Mars took place around 2032, and since Europa is significantly farther away from Earth than Mars, going there first seems anachronistic. A mission to Europa seems like an example of social progress that would have been able to happen as a result of the Bell riots. It had long been established that the Bell riots were the turning point where things in 21st century society started to improve in a way that was necessary for the better future to come. The Europa mission retcons that by establishing that the mission leading to the discovery of microbes on Io, which ended up leading to scientific advancement, was the turning point. I can understand the series wanting to make a statement about the cruelty of ice, and the mention of the sanctuary districts was probably meant to imply that the dissolution of the districts would also bring about the dissolution of ice, but this season still messed with that continuity too much. Also, since Renee Picard is from France, why would she be with NASA instead of ESA, the European Space Agency? That never gets explained. It was pretty easy to tell that the writers were kind of struggling to stretch this season's story out into a full 10 episodes, with a couple in the middle being noticeably shorter than all the others. The 2024 story is told alongside Picard's newly established, horribly tragic backstory. People are correct in pointing out that social problems such as domestic abuse and severe mental illness would not go unsolved in the Star Trek future as we know it, so they had to have Picard's mother refuse help and for the Picard family to live like it was the 1800s or something. I can respect the theme of childhood trauma having a tangible impact on an individual even into old age, but Picard's backstory being this way was just so unnecessary in my opinion. Picard already had plenty of established trauma that the story could have focused on instead, such as losing his best friend Jack Crusher, losing his entire remaining family, being assimilated by the Borg, and being tortured by Cardassians. The backstory also makes it a bit hard to believe that Robert and his family would choose to live at Chateau Picard since it would hold painful memories, just as it's hard to believe that Picard would live there with painful memories of them. This season also features a younger version of Guinan living on Earth in 2024, but she felt very out of character to me. She was obviously younger in the 21st century than the 24th, but she was even younger in the 19th century and seemed more in character then. I don't think the 21st century would make her so cynical when the 19th didn't. Season 2 also has Q return, and he's supposedly dying, but we never find out how or why. Is it because Q wanted to be more like humans and therefore mortal, or that he wanted a way out of the continuum like Quinn did? If that were the case, it would involve him abandoning his son Q Jr., which I don't think he'd ever do, however much he otherwise disliked being in the continuum. The season 2 finale then goes on to establish one of the only good things about the whole season, and quite possibly the best part of Star Trek Picard altogether, Agnes Jurati's new Borg collective. As I mentioned in another video, I want a whole series about this concept. As for other good things in this otherwise lackluster season, I liked the bit of lore about the significance of food and drink in Alorian culture, and the one about the Picard family escaping to England during World War II as a possible way of explaining their English-sounding accents. Q being friendly with Picard was also nice. Really, you could write off the whole tragic backstory thing as just false memories Q gave Picard, just like you could write off These Are the Voyages as not having actually happened because Riker is playing the whole thing out on the holodeck. Maybe the version of 2024 that they went to with the Europa launch was an alternate reality all along. On to Season 3, it infamously features the whole Secret Son plot with Beverly Crusher having her and Picard's biological son, Jack Crusher Jr., and never telling Picard until Jack Jr. was an adult. I already wasn't too keen on Kirk having a secret son in The Wrath of Khan, but this was far worse. Considering how it pained Beverly to see Wesley have to grow up without a father, why would she want to do the same to her second son when she didn't have to? She claims it's to protect him somehow because the knowledge of who his father was might make him a target for Picard's enemies, but was she really convinced that she and Jean-Luc couldn't protect him together? They didn't even have to continue being in a romantic relationship, if they ever were besides the supposed fling when Jack Jr. was conceived. At that point, you'd think Beverly would have just terminated the pregnancy. I actually did the math, and it turns out Beverly would have been around 57 years old when she conceived Jack, which strikes me as hard to believe since most women are past menopause by then. The fact that Beverly would keep such an essential secret from Picard really does an injustice to the close friendship that the two formed throughout their prior screen time. Even though Kirk and Carol Marcus weren't all that close, at least she told him she was pregnant with their son. Beverly's depiction in this season makes her come across as cold and bitter in such a way that feels extremely out of character and makes her almost unlikable. Even though she's played by the same actress as before, she doesn't feel like the same character to me, whereas Ethan Peck's portrayal of Spock in Discovery and Strange New Worlds, for example, does feel like the same character to me as Leonard Nimoy's Spock, even with two different actors playing him. As for Jack Crusher Jr. as a character, the writers really seem to want him to just be a younger version of Picard, right down to the poorly explained English accent, which is another reason that a story about the actual younger Picard might have been better. If they really wanted to introduce a character who was the child of a famous captain, why not have Sisko and Cassidy Yates' child? Another existing child of legacy characters who would be coming of age around this point in the timeline is B'Elanna and Tom Paris's daughter Miral, but she is also neither seen nor mentioned. One big issue I have with Season 3 of Star Trek Picard in particular that I haven't seen discussed as much is how the events of Season 3 perpetuate a myth rooted in pseudoscience that the human brain suddenly becomes fully developed at age 25, when in reality it continually develops throughout a person's lifetime. I realize that it's only rather recently getting around that the claim is a false one, but it still seems like the writers weren't willing to check with the show's science consultants on that one. They could have just said in the show that the Borg nanoprobes affect people whose brain development hasn't reached a certain point in its continual, that is, lifelong, process. It really makes the plot out to be a story of the old versus the young, which has some uncomfortable connotations considering it happens as the result of what is essentially a metaphor for indoctrination. It also seems like a really convoluted way to make the returning TNG characters the heroes. Another way Season 3 ignores real-life science is having the Borg hidden in Jupiter's Great Red Spot. We know that the storm has been actively shrinking for a while and have reason to believe that it will continue doing so. By the beginning of the 25th century, it will be considerably smaller, if not completely gone. So unless another identical storm appeared in the exact location at some point between the 21st and 25th centuries, and they also called it the Great Red Spot for whatever reason, it doesn't make any sense. Like the brain development thing, this is something that the writers could have known if they'd checked with the show's science consultants. I found it out from the Great Red Spot's Wikipedia article. Then we have everything this season did with the Changelings. It makes sense that the Changelings would want revenge on the Federation for attempting to genocide them, but Deep Space Nine already had the beautiful ending with Odo returning to the great length to teach all the changelings everything positive he'd learned from solid beings, and the changelings being so antagonistic just goes back on that. I suppose it's somewhat interesting that the changelings and Borg specifically would team up considering they're both collective societies, but they never properly explain how Jurati's Borg is not the same as the supposed real Borg, when the implication very much seems to have been that Jurati fused with the original Borg Queen. The changelings also look way too realistic and fleshy, and even if the 90s special effects had been able to make them look like that, I doubt they would've. As with the other two seasons, Season 3 of Picard did have a short list of positives. I liked how Captain Shaw used his final words to give Seven command and called her by her preferred name in doing so. It was good of the series to establish that the Enterprise D's saucer section had been retrieved from Viridian 3, and it was satisfying to see the ship put back together again. In my view, the three worst things that Star Trek Generations did were killing Kirk, killing Picard's family, and crashing the Enterprise D. Season 3 of Picard completely fixes one of those things by having the Enterprise D repaired, and it provides an avenue for Kirk's death being fixed, with his body apparently being the subject of Project Phoenix, with the name implying that it's an attempt to resurrect him, presumably with a synth body like Picard's. As I've said though, if Kirk does get brought back to life, the writers had better let him go back through the Guardian of Forever to be with his friends again. As much as I dislike the whole thing about Picard having a secret son, it does fix Picard's family line otherwise dying out with Jean-Luc. There's also what Season 3 did with Data. My opinion from the start was that since Data died in Star Trek Nemesis, they probably should have just let him rest. I disliked how Season 1 established that a backup of Data's consciousness had been trapped in a simulation for who knows how many years. It was an interesting character moment for both Data and Picard for Data to request a true death and Picard honoring it, but then Season 3 attempts to bring Data back again. To my surprise, the way they did so was actually kinda good. I loved seeing Data and Lore combine into a single personality instead of fighting one another, and at least this new version of Data did acknowledge that the version of Data whose consciousness was terminated was resting peacefully, so it all makes a bit more sense. I was not expecting that story element to be handled as well as it was. In the end, I can confidently say that Star Trek Picard did far more harm to Star Trek canon than good. There were just so many other things the series could have been. It feels like Lower Decks and Prodigy managed to hit a sweet spot by taking place after The Next Generation, Deep Space Nine, and Voyager, but before all the events of Star Trek Picard, with the exception of the synth attack on Mars making an appearance at the end of Prodigy's second season. Even in doing so, however, Prodigy managed to create some hope in the midst of that bad situation by having the main characters still be excited to explore the galaxy like Starfleet does best. Season 2 of Prodigy also fixes some other things about Picard by acknowledging that there was a sustained attempt to evacuate Romulus, which is also implied to be the reason that so many synthetic workers were being used at the time to create enough ships in time to complete the evacuation, and that Wesley Crusher did return to visit his mother at least once, and in doing so met his younger brother. Even so, when watching Lower Decks and Prodigy while knowing what's to come, particularly the Frontier Day disaster, the events of Picard just seem to be looming over everything a bit. It's like, all these horrible things are going to happen, but at least things are good and happy for now. It's the same impression I got from watching the Short Treks episode, The Girl Who Made the Stars, featuring Michael Burnham as a little girl bonding with her biological father, Mike. In that case, it's knowing that in a few years, Mike is going to be brutally murdered by Klingons while his daughter here listens to it happen, but at least for now, they still get to be a happy family. Going back to watch Voyager while knowing what eventually happens to Icheb is the same thing once again. It's obvious that the final episode is meant to be a backdoor pilot for a new series called Star Trek Legacy about the USS Enterprise G under the command of Captain 7 of 9. As you've you've probably heard though, it's currently stuck in development hell. People are wondering if Legacy would be just as grimdark as Picard, but there may actually be a chance that it wouldn't. Star Trek Discovery's early seasons were noticeably dark for a Star Trek series, but its spin-off Star Trek Strange New Worlds is much more lighthearted and is episodic rather than serialized, so Legacy as a spin-off of Picard may just do the same thing, if it ever actually gets to air, that is. Strange New Worlds as a spin-off of Discovery was warranted because Discovery's setting moved from the 23rd to the 32nd century starting with its third season, leaving behind many plot points in the 23rd century, such as Spock processing the loss of his sister, Pike knowing about his eventual life-altering injury, and the aftermath of the Federation-Klingon War, all of which Strange New Worlds explores and expands upon even as an episodic series. As for Legacy, I won't hold out hope for the series being better than Picard or it even getting made anytime soon, but however it turned out, it couldn't possibly ignore the long-term ramifications of the Frontier Day disaster. I'm also just going to say that I find it far easier to believe that the events of Discovery and Strange New Worlds are what happened before the events of the original series than that Picard is what happened after The Next Generation, Deep Space Nine, and Voyager. Star Trek Picard is also the one and only instance where I've ever been relieved that most TV show seasons are only 10 episodes nowadays. But then again, if the series had gotten more episodes per season, the writers might have just found that they had less of an excuse not to develop the series' original characters. So what do you think? What are your opinions on Star Trek Picard? Do you agree or disagree with any of my thoughts? Let me know in the comments. Thank you for watching this video. I have more on Star Trek as well as other shows, movies, and games if you want to check those out. Live long and prosper, and I'll see you next time.